Welcome back to the Changemaker Podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. Today, my guest is Robin Dreeke. Robin is a best-selling author, professional speaker, trainer, facilitator, and retired FBI special agent and chief of the Counterintelligence Behavioral Analysis Program. He's taken his life's work of recruiting spies and broken down the art of leadership, communication, and relationship building into 5 steps to trust and 6 signs of who you can trust. I think that's very important these days. Since 2010, Robin has been working with large corporations as well as small companies in every aspect of their business, whether it's a newly promoted leader, executives, sales teams, or customer relations. Robin has crafted his people formula for quick results and maximum success. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Robin Dreeke.
Welcome to the Changemaker Podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that the Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
Thanks, Deke.
Well, Robin, I'm so glad to have you here, but I sort of want to get your backstory and what got you into what has effectively been a life of public service. So you went to the Naval Academy, you served in the Marine Corps, then you were with the FBI. What really drew you into that type of career? Because to me, and we've gotten to know each other pretty well in our few visits, but You really are a true public servant.
Thank you. So I would say, if we're going back in time, there are 2 major people that played that role. We had a friend of our family, and that friend was at the time that I met him and knew him, I was very young, probably elementary school age. Mm-hmm. And his I Love Me room in his house was pretty cool because he was a United Airlines pilot and had been a A4 Skyhawk pilot off the Oriskany during Vietnam. And I thought that was pretty cool. He had a really cool house. His boys were a little bit older than me, and I just thought that was the most amazing thing in the world, being a Navy pilot. So you combine that with, and when you and I are roughly the same age because I turned 54 in about a month, and you combine that with, I call myself a Reagan baby. I did not know about politics. I just listened to Ronald Reagan speak, and he inspired me to be a servant leader. It was all about patriotism. It was all about service to country. And so you combine those 2 things together, and I was all in. And from that point forward, it was all about being a service. And when I think when you grow up with not much, my family struggled financially, and heck, my parents have still never owned a home. You really focus on relationships. You focus on happiness and not pleasure, because pleasure is materialistic and happiness is about a sense of fulfillment through other means. And when you are a service to others, that is the greatest fulfillment we can have. And so I think you combine those things together, and it started that path.
You know, I'd talk a lot about the only power true leaders should concern themselves with is the power to inspire. And you mentioned Ronald Reagan. I actually was home. I don't know if I was playing sick or if I really was sick that day, but for his inauguration. And I could sense, this is a moment in history, but I've shared with people in analyzing presidents, some are great leaders. I would say, obviously, Reagan he had the power to inspire, the power to use humor too, which I think is key. I look at obviously JFK, but so the party doesn't define leadership. But I've felt great, being a kid and having a president that could inspire me. And obviously, he inspired you to a career in public service.
Yeah, and you hit some keys in there. And the first one that you mentioned was humor. He used a lot of self-deprecating humor, and it is one of the greatest forgers of trust, because that's what I ultimately came to understand the world being, and is that dichotomy between understanding what leadership is, which is about service to others, and power, which is a service to self, like you mentioned. And when you're in a leadership position, the best way that you can forge trust is through transparency, openness, and vulnerability. When you actually use self-deprecation humor like he did, it is a great forger of trust because you're empowering people with that transparency and openness so they can make decisions, so they feel in control, so they feel in power. And that is a great forger in trust because human beings were genetically and biologically coded to want to feel in control because it makes us feel safe. And so he made people feel safe by having this transparency and this self-deprecating humor. The funniest thing, he always would poke fun at his own age because the Democrats started poking fun at his age, trying to use that as a weapon against him. Yet when you validate someone's context, and this is what I speak about a lot, understand someone else's point of view and then just validate it. Just understand it, and not necessarily mean you agree with it. It means that you're seeking to understand it. And so when he started poking fun at his own age, the age argument goes out the window. When's the last time you saw a politician, probably yourself when you're doing it, do things like that where they don't argue context? And also, he owned it. And this is another thing that great leaders do. They own their decisions, right, wrong, or indifferent. And nowadays, when things go right, that's the only time any politician owns it. When things go wrong, it's everyone else's fault in the world, in the entire world. It's just really frustrating because the other thing that leaders do is they solve problems.
Yes.
I don't care who caused it. Just solve the problem. Just work it. That's all we're looking for.
You know, it's funny, though, for our younger listeners and viewers, because we do have a lot, I'll just tell a good self-deprecating story about Ronald Reagan when he was shot in the early 80s. And so he went to the operating room and he said to the doctor, he said, "Well, I hope you're a Republican." And the guy said, "Mr. President, we're all Republicans today." But even in that, that moment of crisis that he could use humor. And it seems like, and I'll touch on what you just said, Robin, it seems like politics is bereft of humor, today, unless you're trying to get a laugh from your own party or your own base at the expense of somebody else.
Absolutely. It's a game of one-upsmanship all the time, and it's become exhausting is what it really is.
Yeah.
And it's a shame, but it's pretty transparent at these times as well. So I hopefully change is coming. That's why we call them change makers like yourself.
But I want to get your perspective on this too, and I want to get into why. I mean, you've made a career effectively since you've left the FBI about lecturing on and writing about trust, and trust is the foundational base of every relationship. But I think because we're the same age, I turned 55, so I'm a year older than you this fall as well. But growing up, I actually wanted to be a journalist. And we had Walter Cronkite, right, who was, an anchorman for CBS, who was known as the most trusted man in America. So we had political figures that we could put trust in and people in the media that we did as well. And I think we're just at a critical juncture when the American people don't trust the government and they don't trust the media. That would seem to me to be a little bit dangerous ground.
It's very dangerous ground. And unfortunately, what had happened was back around the time it was both Newt Gingrich as well as Clinton during this time frame. It was the same time frame that just before that when CNN was the first 24-hour news network because cable television had first come out. And for your younger viewers, there was a time in the world when there was no cable TV. there was about 4 or 5 channels you could watch on TV. And the way the FCC worked back then was, in order to have a TV station, you actually had to be able to provide a certain number of hours of public service information. So it was the news. And because news was delivered by the Walter Cronkites of the world in a very non-judgmental, just information way, it was not sellable in the sense of ad space. And so you would watch the 30 minutes or hour news at night pretty much with no commercials because, again, there was no ad space. And then all of a sudden you have CNN and then eventually Fox News and all the 24-hour news cycles come around, which were on cable, which then had to pay for their overhead. They had to pay for they had to pay for all these things. So they have to actually sell ad space. And the only way you're going to sell ad space is you actually have to sensationalize. You have to have opinion pieces rather than just news pieces. And so all these things added to the fact that, hey, we need to sell things. And according to Robert Greene's, he's a great author, although a little bit pessimistic about the human condition when talking about the laws of human nature. Human beings just want their self-opinion validated, and they're also looking to watch pain. And so going back to the time of the Romans and the Colosseums and before that, people like watching pain, and pain sells, unfortunately. So that's what the news cycle started shifting to. They started getting away from pure news, and they started going to opinion pieces, and opinions based on a perspective that would validate the self-opinion of their watchers and sell ad space. So there you go. It's the whole downfall of a lot of it, anyway, in my opinion.
Well, let me ask you this, because I've said, so when I was in office, Facebook came out, or maybe that was even before.
Yep.
But I saw that as a really good avenue, I thought, to get good, accurate information out there to my constituents. I didn't know what it was going to turn into, which is what it is now. I say, my opinion sometimes is the best thing that Facebook is for is finding lost dogs and remembering people's birthdays.
Sure.
But over time, I realized that, with social media, did anybody really do any tests as to the impact that would have on society, and particularly, undermining the trust, creating anger? I don't think that they test marketed that or did the research.
No, as a matter of fact, one of the books behind me, it's a book called Hatching Twitter. And I read the book on how Twitter came about in the early, I think it's like 2000, 2001, same time period as Facebook. And social media started because of these startups, and Twitter literally started because they started as a podcast platform, attempted podcast platform called Odeo, and as these coders, about 5 of them got together, to try to create this by coding this podcast platform. Apple then releases its podcast platform on iTunes, and so that's done. So they literally said, "What else could we do?" And they said, well, I like it when I get updates from my friends because it makes me feel connected. And so they started Twitter based off of first SMS texting, and then they expanded from there. There was zero thought about where it was going to go. Same thing, Facebook started on college campuses as a way for students to connect. Twitter started for giving updates from friends to feel connected. So the whole industry started with this need to feel connected, which goes to the core of human beings, where we want to be non-judgmentally accepted and validated for who we are, again, that self-opinion, and we're looking for like-minded people, and then it just sprung from there unexpectedly in all these different areas.
So, Robin, I want to ask you about this because obviously, one of the main topics in the world, as it should be, is the war between Russia and the Ukraine. But when you were with the FBI, and talk about having to build trust, you recruited Russian spies.
Yes.
So,
That was my job.
I mean, if there's nothing you can say about that, that's fine. But I'm sure that was it.
Lots. What do you want to know about it?
No, how do you do it? I mean, but obviously it's funny. I was telling my producer before you came on, I said, Robin is not what I would picture as the chief of the counterintelligence behavioral analysis program for the FBI. I said, because he just looks like such a nice guy. And then it dinged with me. I'm like, you to be in that position, you would probably need to be non-threatening and able to build trust.
Absolutely. It is hands down the number one thing you're doing when you're, as I always call it, selling the toughest product in the world or service to an individual who doesn't want to buy it. My job was to sell American patriotism, which is an idea, to a Russian intelligence officer who probably doesn't really want to buy that service. And this then goes to everything we do in life. And this is where the whole servant leadership comes in. This is where trust comes in. And it really comes down to every single relationship in the world is based upon this. Well, unless it's an obligation type of relationship where it's father, daughter, spouses, there's some sense of obligation there. But anywhere outside of this, it's this. If you take the time to identify the priorities, challenges, and pain points of another human being, really understand them, what they are, and what they face every day from their perspective, their context, non-judgmentally, and then you offer them resources and solutions to those pain points, you're going to have a potential relationship. And then if you can forge trust, so they trust you with their lives, they trust you not to betray them, that they just forge that trust with you by your behavior, by your transparency, by your openness, by your non-manipulative techniques of just being there for them, you're going to have a relationship, and you're going to recruit a Russian spy if that's what it is. Because it really came down to, I didn't recruit anyone. What I did was I discovered the pain points of individuals, whether it was they wanted their children to be educated in the West, whether they had elderly parents that they didn't want, having a hard time trying to survive under Putin's regime, or they didn't believe in Putin themselves because they're ancient, Russian aristocracy that thought this oligarch was a horrendous human being that was ruining their country. Those are priorities, challenges, and pain points that I have resources for. I can help you, with the links you need to educate your children. I can provide health care for you and your family. In reciprocity, I'm going to share my priorities, challenges, and pain points with you, talking about the national security of the United States and what Russia is doing to undermine it for us and our NATO allies. Then if we can just have a dialogue about an exchange of resources in terms of each other's pain points, and we trust based on all these other factors, we're going to have a relationship. So my job every day was to figure out which one of these people had pain points aligned with my resources, which is exactly what sales is, which is exactly what you're doing as a politician and a change maker. You're discovering the pain points of your constituents, and you're offering resources in terms of solving them.
And getting back into that, I just posted on Instagram for Starts With Us story, the national nonprofit I work with. But I said, I learned a long time ago that it's physically impossible to join hands and work together to address big picture problems, to solve problems, and create positive change in the world if all we're concerned with is pointing fingers and placing blame. And that unfortunately seems like it's a lot of the world. It's not engendering trust. Is how can we use mistrust and fear to manipulate people to get our desired outcome?
Yeah, fear is the greatest inhibitor of everything. When people will use it to wield power, they'll use it to keep you from innovating. They'll keep it from using it for subduing your own curiosity. Fear is the worst thing in the world. Matter of fact, I think it was in the Dalai Lama's book, The Art of Happiness. If you had exactly no fear, what would you start today? If you had no fear of anything in Maslov's hierarchy of needs, if you had no fear of shelter, food, or breathing, what would you actually begin doing today? So let go of that fear and ask yourself, what would it be? And then start mitigating those challenges along the way and start doing it. And you'll see, and I love the study that you did about how connected we all are, and that is all human beings, we just want to get along.
Yeah.
We are genetically and biologically here to be together. I always say, if we're meant to do this solo, we'd be born on top of a mountain by ourselves. But that doesn't matter. We are all here to cooperate and work together. But in order to do that, you have to let go of that fear. But people use it negatively.
Oh, yeah. But that's the thing to me is I'm like, and this would speak to your recruiting Russian spies, I think. So it's harder to hate somebody if you're face to face with them. And you were socialized in a completely different environment than the people that were your counterparts were. And so we make moral judgments based on people a lot of the time, whether it's, whether we know we're doing it or not. We're making sort of moral judgments, and we all have our prejudices and our biases. But to deal with these people that were raised, in the Soviet Union, what could you connect with them through your humanity and through the fact that you were still, they had needs you were trying to meet and you had a request for your needs, but were you able to connect, to sit down and, have a vodka together or something?
100%. Matter of fact, when we use all these great, they call them sophisticated techniques, whether it was using a FISA court to get credit card information and the things they're buying. You had a GPS on their car to see where they're going. You have sources on board that are giving you photographs from family vacations. You have all these different sources of information. And a lot of times the world, and if you're watching movies and Netflix and all these things, you're thinking we're trying to find them spying. No, you're not. The chance of you actually seeing them doing a spy act is really low because they're very good at it. It's called black, they're in the black. In other words, they actually go through hours and hours of what's called a surveillance detection route to make sure that they're clean so they can do their nefarious acts if they're going to do anything nefarious. My job, what I did when I used all those tools and techniques was to find out about them. My first major recruitment operation I was doing, I had only been in the Bureau maybe a year or two. His name was Sergey. And we'll withhold all the information, but here's what I knew. And this was over 20 years ago. Here's what I knew about Sergey. I couldn't tell you where he stopped off and the kind of things he was doing because, he did not have the best interest of the United States at heart. Yes, that's all right because I didn't have the best interest of Russia at heart either. But he was working to help fund his brother, who was a struggling film producer in Moscow. He built his dacha with his father, which is a small summer house on a pond outside the outskirts of Moscow. They used to drink zhelka, which is a type of Russian vodka, together. He had a daughter and a wife. He's former, because I worked mostly in Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and he at the time was a major, and he had served in places like Chechnya, and so we had commonality of the challenges of leadership in that kind of struggle where no one really understands the mission very clearly. So these are things from 22 years ago I remember about this person, this man, this other human being that had all these challenges and pain points in his life, and all I was trying to do was being a resource for him, solving them and overcoming them. It's up to him whether he accepts me as who I am in his life or not. But when it comes to judging him, no, you mentioned critical things in there, and that's, we all have our own morals, ethics, and beliefs. And we have our biases. Our confirmation biases are huge and powerful. Adam Grant, the great author, wrote a great book.
You're obviously well read.
Think again. Yes, I love reading. Think again. And this is what you need to do. I had to learn this hardcore in the FBI because I'm an extrovert. I am from the Northeast. I was originally born in New York City, grew up just north of there. I am born to judge others very fiercely, and my mouth will tell you it all the time. But if you're going to protect the national security of the United States and recruit people and work with people and collaborate with people from all over the world, I probably worked with 22 different nationalities throughout the course of my career. If you knock on someone's door and you start judging them before that door even opens of being different from you, I guarantee, because I ran our behavioral program and just from thousands of people I interacted with, I guarantee you, shields up, no information flow, no trust, no relationship, you might as well not even bother. And so I have muscle memory built around being curious. Non-judgmental curiosity about someone else's context is so important. Think again what Adam Grant wrote is about really when you hear someone else's thought process, their morals, their ethics, their choices, instead of sitting there on your high horse and judging it as wrong, be curious about, wow, here's another human being that took a lot of time in their lives to act and make decisions that they thought was in their best interest. They didn't do so flippantly. They didn't do so haphazardly. So discover what their thought process, discover their context of the world. The best thing I use for this is my friend Jack Barsky, deep cover KGB guy, recruited by the KGB he was born at the end of World War II, was recruited by the KGB from East Germany. He was infused when his information he was given when he was a young age was that communism was going to be the saviors of the world, that the West was evil, that the West was actually fascist, because what he was taught, which is actually true because they had limited context, was at the end of World War II, Germany was set up by the West, and they put a former Nazi sympathizer as the first chancellor of Germany. And so Russia, the Soviet Union, said, wow, The capitalists from the West are pro-Nazi, and we are anti-Nazi because of what Hitler did to the Russians, killing millions during World War II. That's a context. So he is going to be a savior of the world as a communist. Is he wrong? Is he right? Or is he just is? So that's that's the information he's subjected to. Now, granted, he is a good guy. He's a very good guy. Now he comes to the West, he's trained, and he gets new information imparted to him because he's now discovering more, and he changes his views on the world. And now he becomes very pro-West. He becomes actually a born-again Christian because he was told there's these fairy tales by Jesus growing up is what he was subjective to.
Mm-hmm.
You can't control the information that's coming at you. And so if you have a very limited scope of what's provided to you at that young age, do you hold it against the human being? Or do you just try to understand that context so you can make a connection, so you can lower their shields and maybe get new information in there so they can make other decisions in life? So that's the context I use. I don't judge. I do my best.
No, and that's where the curiosity comes in. And it's sort of, okay, well, contextually, I can say, well, somebody acts this way, and so I'm going to assume that they're this way. But I really want to know, what led you to become the person you are,
yes,
and have the views you have. And I've said often that I guess there's an old philosophical tenet that I wish we would use in politics, but we don't. When two philosophers come together and they make an argument, if one's is better than the other philosopher tries to further the first philosophers. And that makes sense to me because we're not always right. And just keeping an open mind, and it's fun to learn about other people. But I guess it's that empathy and trying to at least mentally walk a mile in their shoes.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, Adam Grant, again, in that book, he had a great analogy he used. I was born and raised Catholic. And he uses the analogy of Catholicism in his book. And so he bumps into someone who's a friend of his who says he's Catholic. And Adam Grant goes, why? He goes, well, because I go to church. And so he goes, but why? Why are you Catholic? And the guy got really angry. He got defensive. And about a month later, when they bumped into each other again, he thanked Adam and says, I now know why I'm Catholic.
Yeah.
Interrogate your thought process. Understand your why, and then be curious about the other person's why, and understand that, because this non-judgmental curiosity we're talking about and understand the context, we're not talking about I agree with you. I'm just seeking to understand you. And just because we're being curious about you doesn't mean that we're shifting our morals or shifting our ethics or our decision-making process. But what it is we're open to understanding and communicating and having a dialogue. So I understand your point of view, because that's where change comes from.
Well, it's funny. I was talking to somebody, and I grew up identifying with the Republican Party. My dad was a conservative Republican. My mom a liberal Democrat. But as I got older, I thought, well, what are my views? And I explored. So I'm happily independent now. But I was talking to somebody that's my generation, our generation, that identifies as a Republican, and I got into that. And people don't often like to be challenged, but I'm like, well, why are you a Republican? My mom and dad were Republicans. I said, can you give me one plank out of the Republican Party's platform? Well, no. And so it's sort of over time it changed their mind. But I think that is, here again, it's your environment. If your parents are Republicans, more than likely you're going to be Republican. If your parents are Catholic, you're more than likely going to be a Catholic. But I do agree with you. It's kind of your own challenging somebody to be curious about where they are and why they're there, I think is a really good thing. So I've not read Adam's book yet. I have it on my bookshelf, and so I'm going to get to reading that.
Him, Simon Sinek, they're the two really, and it's challenging sometimes too. And I mentioned Robert Greene. And another one, I love the Stoic stuff by Ryan Holiday, and those are just on leadership side, not talking about the biographies. I love reading and everything, but it's fascinating because there are authors that I don't necessarily agree with, on them as their choices and their political or lack of political affiliations they have. But when you look at the content that someone's putting out, that's what I focus on.
Yeah.
Because, and this is where I think it's really important for people to understand, you don't have to like someone to see the value in someone, because everyone has value, and everyone has some fantastic ideas, and everyone has things that aren't so good. Everyone, absolutely everyone. So find their greatness, because everyone has it. And that's
Yeah.
what we seek to understand. That's what we can validate, and that's what we can pass on to others. Is there?
Yeah.
I mean, I am fanatic. There are some authors I absolutely will read everything they put out, but I would never interview them because I just don't have anything in common with them.
Well, as we sort of get towards the end, I do want to, with what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia, do you have any, because you're obviously familiar with geopolitical politics and situations, and do you have any idea, would you hazard a guess as to how it's going to work out?
So I sit on a panel with both Jack Barsky, the former KGB guy, and another gentleman, Dan Hoffman, who's a former CIA chief of station over in Moscow and with the CIA, and we discuss this frequently. Past patterns of human behavior are great indicators of future ones. When I joined the FBI over 20 years ago, guess who was in charge? Putin. And so we actually have over 20 years of looking at behaviors of him, but the world has a very short memory because our politicians and the world's politicians shift so frequently. So here's my predictor. It's going to continue as long as he continues, and he's going to keep shooting until he runs out of bullets or he runs out of people that want to shoot his bullets. And he's always playing the long game because he's not trying to be reelected in a couple of years.
Yep.
And so he's a very patient. You look at what he did in Georgia. You look at what he's done in Chechnya. You look at what he did when he annexed, parts of Ukraine before, and he's trying to just hold on to what he has. What has served the West very well and Ukraine very well is that Russia, and this has been really shown throughout this, luckily for us, was that they might have had the technological advantage when it came to like the ship the Moskva with its anti-missiles and their tanks and their aircraft, but they didn't train it very well. And because they don't operate on a premise inside their military based on leadership, they base it on power. And their generals and their colonels are the ones that are actually running things instead of our military and the West military, which is their senior staff NCOs that are running things. And also because their military had no idea, believe it or not, their military had no idea that they're going to war. They thought it was another training exercise. They had just gotten off it. So there's a few things that happen here. Everyone's wondering at the very beginning, what army in its right mind would have a convoy sitting in the middle of a highway to get blown up and stalled? You know what kind of convoy was? A convoy that had no idea they're going to war. What kind of military has their generals and colonels taken out rampantly all the time? Well, one that's not using crypto gear to encode things because they, again, had no idea they're going to war. So what military has their flagship destroyed by missiles that has the most sophisticated anti-missile system on it? Well, a military that doesn't train their people very well. And so, and same thing with the Russian Air Force. Why is the Russian Air Force, which has some of the most sophisticated aircraft in the entire world that they sell all over the world, not being effective or not even being utilized? Well, because they don't train. So all these things are great for the West, but they're also great drains on resources for us as well.
Yep.
So I think it's going to continue. I think, luckily for us, we have Zelensky, a very much Reagan-like, where he's a great communicator because people would say this about Reagan. Well, he's only a good president because he was an actor. No, he was an actor because he's a great communicator first.
Yep.
And so you're seeing the same thing with Zelensky. He's a great communicator. He goes into acting because he had these communication skills, because he knew how to communicate in terms of an audience. Good. And so he's shown great resolve, and he's shown these great pithy moments where he says, "I don't need to be evacuated. I need bullets." Lines like that will be remembered forever, just like Reagan lines, just like Winston Churchill lines. And so I think it's going to continue as a slow grind until Ukraine will slowly take their territories back. I really see that happening, and we'll see what happens. But even if Putin leaves, the infrastructure around him is still there. So
Yeah.
you're not going to see these great major shifts if he leaves.
Well, one thing, and I just going back to leadership, one thing that I'm hopeful, and I'm always the eternal optimist, but I thought, what impact is Zelensky's leadership going to have on future generations, right?
Right.
Because past generations could look to a Reagan or, a Churchill or so many other inspirational leaders. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of those. I mean, there are some on the world stage, and I wish we had some Americans that I could point to as that's our Zelensky. But as you say, those quotes are going to be remembered. He's going to be studied in history classes. And so I'm hopeful that his impact shows kids what an inspirational leader looks like. Yeah, that's the guy. He's not perfect because no leader ever is, but that's the guy that I would want to be.
Yeah, and I don't want to take away from any other world leaders right now, but if you're not placed in a position where the existence of your country is on the line, you might not know what you're capable of as well. You know, human beings, one of the problems and challenges we have in our own country is that we have abundance. Human beings throughout history of mankind do not do well in abundance. We are genetically and biologically coded to innovate when we are in the deprivation mode. Whether whatever your belief system is at the dawn of man, whatever you think that is, we were in constant survival mode. And we only thrive, we only innovate, and we only collaborate and rise to the occasion when we are in deprivation mode. And when the world hits these abundance periods, they create new problems out of nowhere because they're bored. They're literally bored because there's no problems to solve. And so you see the divisiveness we have right now because literally we're in a time of abundance. And so when you're in a time of abundance, for 10 or 20 years, like the States have been and other parts of the world, not all, but many, it's easy to get complacent and just do dumb things to try to create problems out of nowhere until a real problem arises where someone's trying to take your country from you, like Zelensky's faced.
Well, Robin, as we get down to the end, I've got two questions for you. The first is, where can our listeners and viewers find you?
Sure. It's really easy. It's all one stop. It's called peopleformula.com. All one word, peopleformula.com. Everything from my free course on the 4 keys of communication that you can get through there. My podcast, the Forged by Trust podcast, which Deke will be on here in a couple weeks as well. and
Home and Away series.
And you can scale it up as much as you want. You can pay me lots of money to coach and mentor you, as well as have me into your groups and organizations. But there is plenty of free resources on there as well. So there you go, peopleformula.com.
Well, my last question for you is, so I'd like to ask everybody this. In your life, what brings a smile to your face regularly and puts joy in your heart?
A great conversation. It's really simple. Ask another great question I read in a book. Instead of a bucket list, what would you do if you have like 6 months or only 12 months left? What would you actually do if you knew you only had 12 hours left on this planet? What would you do? How would you spend that time? And I thought about this, and I thought about, when have I actually internally felt the greatest joy in my life? When are you the happiest? When do you feel the greatest joy, smiling, laughter? And mine is great conversations, playing a silly card game like Exploding Kittens or something like that with my kids. And I have grown kids, so my greatest joy is, number one, having a great conversation with my close friends and family. And if they can't be around, it's a great conversation with anyone else. So having a great conversation, that's it.
You and I have that and so much more in common, but I've got a game for you to look into. It's a dice game called Shut the Box.
I like
you
the
will love it. Easy to play, but addictive. So you can play with 4 people or 6 people.
I love it. I'm going to check it out, Deke. Thanks. It creates great conversations and fun times.
Well, Robin, thank you for being an absolute awesome guest, and I very much look forward to continuing the dialogue. I just feel like, thank you to our friend Dove Barron for connecting us.
Absolutely.
I think we're kindred spirits, and I think there are more people out there that think like us than think like other folks, and so I'm just trying to unite the tribe, and you're definitely part of my tribe.
I couldn't agree with you more, Deke, and I'm happy to be on board.
All right. Thanks, man. Well, that's all the time we have. So we are dropping the mic and we are out. Hey, guys, thanks for listening to or watching the Changemaker podcast today. greatly appreciate it. If you're listening and you want to see the video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Deke Copenhaver. That's a pretty easy to remember, I would think. But really, we also want to remind you to like, subscribe, rate across all platforms, download. And if you're looking for a coach, a speaker, or anything, you know where to find me. Just email me at dekecopenhaver.com. And thanks so much for listening.